Former President Trump's big lie continues to dominate headlines. This week, he released a statement saying Republicans will not vote in the midterm and general elections until alleged voter fraud in the 2020 election is, quote, solved. He pushed a similar message at a Save America rally in Iowa this past weekend, where he called on Republicans to stand strong and not back down.
Congressional Republicans must stand strong. This is not a time for Republicans to fold, to walk away, to quit, to be afraid. Whatever happens, happens. They have to be strong. Don't worry about being impeached.
Reminder, President Biden defeated former President Trump by a 306 to 232 electoral college margin. Since then, Trump and his Republican allies have made countless claims of voter fraud, but almost every lawsuit regarding the issue has either been dropped or dismissed, and numerous recounts and audits have found no evidence of widespread irregularities. So joining us now to discuss is Timothy Snyder, who is a Levin Professor of History at Yale University. Professor, good to have you.
Glad to be with you.
Former President Trump continues to push these unproven claims of a stolen election. You say that the right-wing media has created a safe space for his big lie. Explain what you mean.
Well, what I mean is that democracy is all about checking yourself. Democracy is all about accepting that sometimes the facts aren't what you want them to be. Being a citizen means that you know that sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. Mr. Trump has always been someone who has said that he doesn't really trust election results, that he'll try to stay in power regardless of what they are. He's been very consistent about that. In last November, he started telling the big lie that he won. And what I mean by a safe space is that much of the right-wing media has now created this zone where this lie is either pronounced or it's not challenged. And that's very dangerous for democracy, because democracy needs basic facts like who won elections.
And, you also talked about the riot at the Capitol on January 6th, and that you say was, it was organized on behalf of the big lie. But you also talk about the fact that race and racism played a factor in this riot. That we know that there were representatives from groups that are considered white supremacist groups. That part of the conversation seems not to be happening. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Oh, that's a very important point. So there's Mr. Trump's big lie, which is on the surface. His claim that he won an election that he lost by 7 million votes. He lost by more than any incumbent has lost by since Jimmy Carter back in 1980. He lost decisively, got thumped. He tells a big lie, but the structure of the big lie is something like this. If you only count the white people, then I won. Or he says, let's think about those cities, Detroit, Philadelphia, and so on. And of course, when he says cities, what he's triggering in the minds of his supporters or his sympathizers or people who are just racist is Black people, that maybe Black people can't count votes, or maybe Black people's votes shouldn't count. And that's the deep underlying problem of American democracy, one that we've had obviously since the very beginning of our history, with slavery, with Reconstruction, with the de facto disenfranchisement of all African Americans in the South for almost 100 years after the Civil War, and with the voter suppression efforts that continue today. So there's this underlying problem in America, which is a lot of folks don't really quite think that Black people should be allowed to vote. And Mr. Trump is playing on that. He's playing on the worst of American traditions. And those are traditions that lead us away from democracy. And this is, of course, not just a problem for people of color. If white people allow this issue to be used, they're also being allowed to use it against them. Because if democracy goes down, in the end, none of our votes is going to count.
So, Professor, we were all taught in school, and we have always held up as an example, this country, as an example to others, because we use this term American exceptionalism, right? That our country was founded as a nation, a distinct body of ideas, right? That was very unique at the time from other nation states. Liberty, equality before the law, individual responsibility for some, because not everybody was treated equal under our laws. So is American exceptionalism a myth? I mean, the idea that it can't happen here, that's what you me, others who travel abroad, I've lived abroad half my life, you talk to other people and you look at other countries and you see what happens in some of these countries and you say, well, that could never happen in the United States of America because of some of the things I just talked about. Was that a myth?
I mean, American exceptionalism is an invitation to disaster, because if you think that you're going to be a democracy because of who you are, or if you think you're going to be a democracy because of something that other people did 250 years ago, or if you think you're going to be a democracy because somehow history starts anew every time you say so, then you're going to lose democracy. Democracy is about the people ruling. Democracy will only arise if people want to rule, if they take charge of their own history. Democracy is not a heritage. Democracy is a project. So the moment that I hear people talking about American exceptionalism, I worry a lot, because that exceptionalism isn't going to carry us anywhere. Only our own efforts to create a right to vote, to confirm a right to vote, can take us somewhere, can take us into a future where we are a more democratic country than we are now.
Well, I wonder if I subscribe to a little bit of American exceptionalism, because I know as I watched the riot, on January 6th, I remember thinking to myself, well, this is as far as it could ever go. I mean, this is a wake-up call. We need to pull things back to where they should be. But then in the days and the months afterwards, I came to realize that not everyone felt the way that I did. And now, there are concerns. I don't know, how concerned are you as we move towards, the next election? I mean, should we be worried about a similar reaction should the election not go one group's way?
Well, I mean, I'm afraid that this is exactly what's happening. It's not just that January 6th and this terrorist attack on the sanctuary of democracy is being treated like something normal. It's also that behind that is this big lie. And the big lie doesn't just apply to Mr. Trump losing the election by 7 million votes. It's going to apply to any time Republicans lose elections. So the new game plan going forward is, if, as Lindsey Graham said many months ago, if we win, we win. If they win, it's because they cheated. And so when Republicans win, if it's close at all, there's going to be an attempt to claim fraud. And what this means basically is an attempt to put democracy aside. We're not going to count votes unless they add up the way that we want them to add up. So I'm very concerned about 2022 and especially about 2024, because if you look at history, what history shows is that a failed coup attempt is practiced for a successful coup attempt. And if you look at American history, what you see is these attempts to rig votes, these attempts to suppress votes, come from a place which is unfortunately anti-democratic. So I think this is the main story. The main story is American democracy, not parties, not individuals, but American democracy itself.
So, Professor, are you at all, and I read your book on tyranny several years ago. You've got a new version that's out now. But I wonder, when we look at history and we use examples from other states, nation states, countries that have fallen to coup attempts, there are certain levers that we like to believe in this country that we had that would serve as a check on even what we saw on January 6th, even another version of that. We have the courts. Generally, coup attempts happen. It's not just the seat of government that sees, it's the media, it's the military. The people that we just showed on video there on our screens, I don't know what their ultimate goal was other than to cause violence and mayhem and perhaps kill members of Congress that they came across, or even the vice president, as it's been reported. But even in looking at 2022 or 2024, something like what we're describing here would have to encompass all of those various levers. And do you see that as a possibility?
Well, so first of all, when we look at Mr. Trump's coup attempt, I mean, the more we know, the more we realize that it wasn't just a matter of his summoning his followers to attack Congress people. He was also trying to get the Department of Justice to overturn the results. And there were people who had been in his inner circle, for example, Michael Flynn, who were openly calling for a violent coup d'etat. So it's like a coup attempt where he didn't really have his act together. He was using his normal Trumpian methods, which is to announce what he's going to do in advance, get people ready for it, and then hope that somehow support would emerge at the right time. And some support emerged, just not enough support. The problem looking forward is that rather than this being just a project of one man, as it was in 2020, we're now looking at a concerted effort, which partly comes from below, with state legislatures passing laws, with people talking the way that Mr. Trump is talking, but not he alone, about the way that fraud is this persistent issue, which sets us up for a scenario in 2024 where things are just not clear, right? I mean, imagine that Mr. Trump or some other Republican candidate loses, the claim of fraud is made. It's not that everybody has to go along and the coup has to eventually succeed. If it's contested, then we're in completely uncharted constitutional territory. The Supreme Court might make a ruling, but not everybody might take that ruling seriously, especially given the Supreme Court's pretty questionable attitude towards presidential voting in general. And then we could have conflict in the United States of America. That's the scenario I'm looking for, that I'm worried about, that if we don't have a clean election in 2024, we don't have anywhere to go except conflict. I agree with you. It's not that institutions will clearly line up one way or another. And that's exactly the problem.
So one last question from me, I guess. Sure. When we read, so in the books that are out there around history, that examine the history of totalitarian states or states that slipped into authoritarianism, very often there's not a lot of perspective on what just ordinary people were up to. I mean, you hear about what the leaders are up to, you hear about what the opposition is doing, but it's the rare book that pays attention to people in Nazi Germany who weren't caught up in politics, or in the Czech Republic, the former Czechoslovakia, or wherever we've seen movements like this take root. So the question becomes, what can ordinary people do? A lot of the things that we see and we hear happen on social media and in the media in the media bubble. But when you go to a baseball game or you go to your kid's, soccer match, you don't hear a lot of people talking about some of the things that we're discussing here. And I wonder if in your mind that is because people are complacent, or because maybe it's not as dire as perhaps some historians and some analysts are suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that we do know is that people matter the most when they're in groups. So that's a lesson from history, but it's also a lesson from 2020, where we had this interesting moment in U.S. history where American business and American labor were actually on the same side. Both of them were in favor of counting the votes. And I think I have a feeling that when historians later write about 2020, that is going to seem very important. And I hope that will reproduce itself going forward, because business also has an interest in there not being chaos. And the situation where we have unclarity because of all of these, because of the big lie, is going to be chaos for the American economy. But I take your point completely. I don't think the fact that we don't talk about this is a good sign. I think it's a sign that we're polarized. I think it's a sign that we're afraid to talk about important things in public. And that's why so much of On Tyranny is about things like making eye contact and small talk and not losing track of our neighbor, and being prepared for the chance that when something does come up, we can talk about it in a friendly and engaged way and don't immediately retreat back into our own comfort zone. That's a very important part of politics. I mean, everybody from the ancient Greeks forward who has thought about democracy believed that democracy was local and it was about contact between people who are neighbors, who live close together. We're losing that, as you say, largely thanks to social media. And it's very important we make a conscious effort to keep that going. Even if we don't agree or can't convince each other, it's very important that folks understand that we're all Americans, that we're all people, and that we're not two tribes divided divided in a way that is going to have to lead to some kind of conflict. Because that's what when Mr. Trump says, stay strong, no matter what happens, that's what he's talking about. He's saying one day you're going to be called upon to do something violent. That's what he's saying. And we have to make sure by our own efforts that we don't let it get that far.
It's an excellent.
Professor Timothy Snyder, you were making so many really interesting points. We could probably talk to you for an hour. Thank you so much.
Very glad to be with you.